Welcome to all. Very nice. Thank you very much for joining today. I'm just waiting a minute because the participants are still coming in. Marta, shall I go? Okay. So maybe let's start officially the webinar that we've organized for the 10 years anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And welcome to all. We are very happy that you could all join, the panelists and the participants as well. And I'm greeting you actually from Prague, Czechia, where the French ambassador Stéphane Crouza, who is the former climate ambassador, organized a discussion at the university on the anniversaries on climate and doing simulation about negotiations. Just to tell you, they didn't manage to reach an agreement that would allow to remain on a sustainable path at 1.5, but still they were very enthusiastic about the climate negotiations. So, of course, for all of us from the climate community and around the climate community, this year is a very emblematic year. And it is very important to us that as we reach the formal anniversary of the Paris Agreement, we take a moment together and to celebrate, not with complacency, but still recognizing the path that has been already covered and the achievements. Although we all know that we're still not on a trajectory that scientists tell us would keep us safe. But I think it is important to gather and to look at, what we've achieved so far and how we can go from here. On IDRI's side, the teams have been very busy this year, looking back to the ride over the last 10 years and where we stand today and how to look up to the future. We have a two-pager that synthesizes all the publications that we have developed this year, from the diagnostic analysis of the Paris Agreement to the deep decarbonization report that was looking into what has happened in 19 countries and going through the various briefs on implementation and the core issues to address that were addressed at the COP and after, like transitioning away from fossil fuels, just transition, implementation, and so on. By the way, we are today launching our series of webcasts on the Paris Agreement in English. So watch out for that, and I hope you will enjoy them. But of course, as I said that, a lot of this work has been done in partnership with you and could have not been done without you, actually, on the panel today and in the audience as well. And today is really a day and a way to thank you for all these extremely stimulating partnerships through our participation in COPs together, but also as the climate agenda colludes more and more with the economic and the security agenda in other fora, such as the G20, T20, the International Maritime Organizations, the OECD, and many, many other fora where we've been working together to try and move the needle. And honestly, I've been amazed by the level of expertise, the level of commitment of the think tank community on the topic of climate. And above all, the capacity and willingness to continue discussing across countries at a time when government officials seem to struggle more and more to keep the dialogue open and to continue engaging. I mentioned earlier that we should not be complacent on this anniversary day, and I know that none of you are. And we should be actually organizing, we should be strategizing for the years to come. So please, I really invite you to be bold in your interventions today, in your proposals, and to put on the table the ideas, your ideas, even the less conventional ones. And let's think about the critical milestones ahead and how to advance our transitions and adaptation in a sustainable and equitable way. Also considering the broader picture of what this systemic change means and how it interacts with significant trends, the digital AI revolution, as well as the demographics, aging in some part of the world and growing population in other parts of the world. So I really look forward to your inputs today, to the discussions. And for those of you that are not formally on the panel, you can use the chat to input your thoughts and to contribute as well to the discussion of today. With that, I thank you again very much for joining us today, and I'll hand over to Marta, who will be facilitating the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Celine, and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, my name is Marta Torres. I'm the director of the climate program, and as Celine was saying, I also really want to join the thank you for all of you, both in the audience and the panelists, for being here. Also on behalf of the international climate team, key members that are here sitting around me, Alain van Rossum, Ana Perez, Adel Tanguy. And really, I know that it's Friday afternoon, it's after the COP, we're all exhausted. So I think that boost that maybe the anniversary day gave us, I hope that we all look forward, kind of to use that bit of energy that we have, and to especially try to, as Celine was saying, to inspire us and to wrap up that year of many reflections and many deliberations on how do we need to move forward. So what is most important here is that over the next hour and a half, we will have a conversation with a panel, which is an extraordinary lineup, and I'm just going to present them right now. And you will see that basically they cover think tanks, experts, private sector, and civil society organization perspective. And they will bring insights that come more from a national level, sectoral level, or global perspective. So hopefully we have a bit as much as it's possible to, diverse perspective into those reflections that we've been having. So the panel, we have Karine de Boisson, Director of Impact Department at the group of EDF. We have Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Senior Fellow at the think tank CW in India. We have Anthony Dane, founding partner at the think tank in South Africa called Southern Transitions. We have Tasneem Essop, Executive Director of CAN International. We have Mayara Foley, Executive Director and co-founder of Plataforma CIPO. We have Niels Pedersen, Executive Director of the UN Global Compact in France. We have Andrew Prack, Managing Director of Policy at Women Business. We have Carlos Rittel, Director of Public Policy for Forest and Climate Change at WCS. We have Anna Young, Director of the Environment and Society Center at Chatham House. And we have Zhang Kuyong, Executive Director of the International Cooperation Program at the Energy Foundation China. All of those would deserve hours of introduction, but I think most of you know them. Please, otherwise, just also when necessary, feel free, panelists, to, introduce a bit more where you come from. But as Celine said, many of you here because of the joint work that we've been doing, and as a way to thank you for that collaboration. So let's start with the conversation. So as the year started, we had this first diagnosis, as Celine was saying, to look back at what has the Paris Agreement achieved. Always very much for us was more about what is working, what is not working, so that we knew that over the year we would have this discussion about what the achievements, the merits, what needs to change, what needs to be enforced. And I think all together here we wanted to inform that debate so that was more productive. So it was not just, okay, it has worked, the Paris Agreement, but could do better, but really what is not working? What is yes? Where do we need to put our energy and our efforts? And we went back to the theory of change in a way, not to just look at, okay, are we fulfilling, provisions in a more narrow interpretation of implementing the treaty, but really how is this moving? And we kind of try to structure the theory of change behind the Paris Agreement in 4 pillars. And those, I'm going to be introducing them as a way to start that conversation. The first pillar was about the importance of ensuring universal action. And looking back, we were saying that over the past decade, the Paris Agreement has suffered a lot of geopolitical turbulence. There have been shifting alliances and leadership vacuums, and especially, of course, in the recent years, seeing a bit more of a fragile moment, particularly with Trump coming in, etc. Yet, universal participation has remained, and it was one of the core strengths. Until now, we saw quite, being a resilient treaty. Plus, not just having the countries, but a universal implementation of the treaty that it has. But so we ask ourselves now going forward, right? We see the increasing geopolitical complexity and the shifting of the alliances. We've seen some of this at the COP30, and I'm sure, for example, Mayara could elaborate more on this. So we want to ask both Mayara and Tasnim, how do we protect this universal collective action under these adverse political leaderships that we perceive at the moment and perhaps in the next few years? And what pathways or objective could guide us at least towards COP31 or COP32, just to give a time horizon. Mayara, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Celine, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of this webinar and for the work that we've been building together with IDRI over the past couple of years. Well, before I talk about the future, I just wanted to dedicate like 1 minute to say that I really think that COP30 delivered what was possible considering the current geopolitical circumstances that you described quite well, Marta, and of course the constraints of a system that is rigid, that operates by consensus and therefore doesn't leave us with much room for creativity and structural transformation. So despite of those constraints, we saw one of the most progressive languages that COP has ever delivered in terms of human rights, addressing the rights of indigenous people, but also people of African descent, which is the first time they are acknowledged in a COP decision. We had this institutional mechanism on just transition and a significant victory, perhaps disappointing on the adaptation indicators, but quite a good surprise when it comes to the language on tripling the flows for adaptation finance. So there were good things that came out of it. And of course, I don't have time to go one by one, and I'll try to think now looking forward and the question that you pose about how to keep the integrity of this regime and of the universal collective action. And for me, this integrity depends to a large extent on addressing what the science tells us is at the root of the problem, which is the issue of fossil fuels. And I think we should not naturalize the fact that fossil fuels is not an agenda item within a COP, or we shouldn't naturalize the fact that we have once again a decision that doesn't have a single reference to fossil fuels. And I think it was quite interesting what Brazil tried to do in terms of raising the political attention to these topics throughout negotiations. It was not successful to put that in the text, but interestingly, it announced at the closing plenary this voluntary process of a roadmap on the transition away from fossil fuel. And Ambassador André Correia do Lago, the COP30 president, had said that he wishes to exercise his prerogative as COP30 president until the end, so until COP31, and he expects that 80 to 90% of his time will be dedicated to this roadmap processes. So looking forward, I think this brings us an opportunity to first shape this process, but also I'd say to assess whether or not we should and how we could connect this to existing and emerging initiatives like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance, and of course use this and intelligently to see how this process, which is voluntary, can be used as a way to bring this issue of fossil fuel back on the UNFCCC negotiation agenda. So just to conclude, I think, without a credible response on fossil fuels and of course on finance, which I believe we will address a bit later on in this conversation, it will be difficult to safeguard this collective system that we know is necessary, even if we take the geopolitical complexities out of the equation. So stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Maya. That was great. And around science, I'm now going to move to Tasneem. Tasneem, welcome. What would you add to that question?
Thanks very much, Marta. Thanks to Idri for the invitation. So I think it's going to be important for us to, in our reflection of this 10-year anniversary of Paris, to be quite frank about some of the expectations we've had of the Paris Agreement. Of course, the universality of actions is critical. We need to always recognize that the Paris Agreement and its architecture is, of course, a bottom-up voluntary architecture. So the whole architecture of the Paris Agreement also contributes to the kinds of challenges that emerge, throughout the 10 years. So we should not ignore that. And so the kinds of expectations that we have of moving towards more centralized, top-down possibilities for change within that architecture is pretty limited. And so what we need to explore is what is possible in a bottom-up voluntary architecture such as the Paris Agreement. And so that is probably going to be linked to what Mayra just said about this expectation that we would deliver something centralized, top-down, roadmap type outcomes or even engagements on fossil fuels is something we need to interrogate. So I'm, when this came up on the agenda of the COP, not on the agenda, but in the space of the COP, it came as quite a bit of a surprise because we didn't come into the COP with any expectation that that was even going to be something that will be looked at. Of course, as CAN, we came into the COP on the just transition, on the mechanism, and we're super, super happy about the outcome. It's far-reaching if people actually went and read that text. The second point I want to make is that the Paris Agreement, throughout from its adoption right through today, it does not take, it isn't there in a bubble. And when we talk geopolitics and the changes in geopolitics, we need to define what we mean by those shifts in geopolitics. And the sad reality is that unfortunately, there's been, I would, in my personal assessment, a backward slide towards more fragmentation and polarization between the global north and the global south. And essentially that is about, in this past 10 years, a growing and accelerated concentration of wealth and a concentration of power. And the way that power then gets used, and in these recent years, we have seen how that power has actually been abused. Extractivism between global north and global south hasn't shifted, it's actually accelerated as well. But more importantly, and I would argue, it's at the heart of the challenges in relation to this polarization and getting, governments, especially from the global south, to step up far more boldly. They are bold, and I want to make that very clear. Global south, including emerging economies, have actually taken far-reaching actions already. That's not necessarily acknowledged. However, what we always have to consider is, in fact, the issue of equity. Now, people might dismiss this, and when we bring up issues of justice, of equity, it's easily dismissible. It's seen to be, peripheral. The reality is, it has always been central to these negotiations. If we do not address equity, and many times equity is also then in the form of addressing justice and equity, it takes the form of climate finance, which has been the fault line throughout the period since the adoption of so we ignore that at our own peril. And it does affect our ability to make progress, especially in negotiations. So it's going to be important, for example, there's some really staggering data that has come out in the 3rd edition of the World Inequality Report that literally provides the data that we need to factor into our work in the climate community, where 10% own 3/4 of the wealth in the world. And it is exactly that 10% that also are responsible for emitting 77%. So carbon emissions by the 10%, 77%, versus those in the bottom half of the world's population emit 3%, are responsible for 3% of carbon emissions. And yet they carry the worst burdens of the climate impacts. In fact, their income, 75% of global income loss due to climate is borne by the bottom half of the world population. Now, this is a reality that also governments, when they come to negotiating tables, will obviously factor in. Not all the time, but should be factoring in. So the issue of justice, inequity, is something that cuts across all of this. And as civil society, of course, we put this front and center in the work that we do at the COPs. And so just to conclude, Marta, to say, we believe that the outcome in Brazil, of course, it's a mixed bag of outcomes. But as I said, civil society movements went into that COP to fight for an outcome on the just transition. We managed to secure a massive victory. The recognition that when we talk about just transition, we are in fact talking about a whole of economy, whole of society approach is fundamental. These are things that now would have to drive national level just transition planning. The pathways that we develop at a national level will be guided by the most extensive rights-based language ever since even stronger than the Paris Agreement. So we've got a lot to celebrate. There is an opportunity through this outcome to really move forward towards, of course, getting the mechanism agreed to in this year by Turkey, but certainly for the work that we have to do at national levels. And that is what the Paris Agreement was all about. It's what we do at national levels that become important. So I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Tazima, and also we celebrated that victory in the sense that for us, and as we wrote in our brief also on the just transition mechanism, that equity had to be addressed as part of the ingredient, and particularly as you said it much better, Tasneem, the second pillar for us in that unpacking now that theory of change was indeed that there is that promise, right, that we are creating a better world, a world that is more equitable and that has that shared prosperity, and that is what that promise would make sure that everyone wants to be part of that, because we're doing it so not set maybe to resolve, of course, all the injustices that we have, but that there is such a straight relationship between climate and development and what we're seeing about the concentration of wealth, etc., that had to go hand in hand. And that pillar of creating that vision of a new economy that will provide those opportunities. I think we saw some things definitely in the just transition discussion, but beyond that also the focus on green industrialization, saying, okay, this is where we see the opportunity and the appetite to discuss the enablers of such opportunities, no, being trade, being finance, being investments, etc., etc. And this was at the heart of the discussions, probably more than in other times. Now, it's probably for, we'll see, one thing is discussing there and maybe raising the importance, the political importance, but what can be done is different. And that's where I'm going to be asking Hu-Young, Anthony, and Niels to provide their perspective on these questions. First is, how do you see, that we are evaluating the Paris Agreement performance, in promoting this more equitable and prosperous future? So is the Paris Agreement contributing, to some a better, an economy that for a better future, for emphasizing the right for sustainable development, or has the Paris Agreement forgotten about that, and is focusing only on other things? What are the interpretations that you see about these new opportunities that had to be generated with this huge transition that we're doing? How do you think the Paris Agreement has been triggering all of those? And going forward, more important, what are the best approaches and fora that you see to discuss those opportunities and the enablers to make them a reality? So please, Hu-Young, if you can go first.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Thank you for having me. So, yes, my answer is yes. It's actually from my observation and according to my understanding is that both Chinese government and the Chinese entrepreneurs are supporting the Paris Agreement very much. It's actually Chinese government has been safeguarding the Paris Agreement. It's before the COP30. President Xi announced our new NDCs, and our Premier Ding went to Brazil to attend the COP30. And I think it was the first time Chinese government attended the Open Coalition on Compliance on Carbon Market. So it's the first time for Chinese official delegation to attend an initiative outside of UNFCCC. It's a very, very positive signals. So for Chinese entrepreneurs, I think my observation is that they are really embracing the Paris Agreement. You may find our Chinese a big EV company is BYD and Great Wall, who are the silver partner of COP30. And I find many Chinese companies like Tencent, it's a biggest digital company, and Three Gorges Corporation is the biggest hydrogen company. Lots of companies attended the COP30 to discuss their understanding and how to they support how to address climate change. It's actually there's a general consensus in Chinese society. We believe, or they believe, addressing climate change as an opportunity for China to shift away from the coal-fired based economy to a clean economy and based on the renewable energy. So that reason you may find the Chinese addressing climate policy is strongly aligned with our industrial policies. They are one policies. So that's my observation. Of course, we have lots of challenges ahead of us, especially some colleagues mentioned the coal power plant. So we need to try our best to retire this coal power plant as soon as possible. But we still have some kinds of very big challenges, especially some challenges from interested group, who are relying on coal. Yeah, the benefit of our coal. So it's a big challenge for us, I think. So it's just my observation share with you. I stop here. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you so much. And I do recognize also, in the EU-China dialogues that we had the chance, to collaborate with you, or indeed the private sector representative, that there, we had many conversations about these opportunities and how to make them larger and sustainable, which I think also, was very positive. And was that feeling also that COP30 gave us, right? That the transition is happening. Now the issue is who gets the opportunities, and back to Tasneem's point, how they are being distributed as well. So how, maybe a perspective then, Anthony, from be more an African perspective, or from your own interpretation from the discussions that you were also involved in the Just Transition work. Anthony.
Yes, thanks, Marta, and thanks to IDRI for this opportunity, and always a pleasure collaborating. So I think at a high level, there have been challenges in operationalizing equity, and building on some of what Tasneem was describing. That's particularly important from an African perspective. So, just in terms of the framing for Africa, and obviously a lot of the global South more generally, a vision for a new economy is critical. The transition cannot be a transition from high carbon poverty to low carbon poverty. And so, this framing around a whole of economy, whole of society approach to just transitions is fundamental. And it's about broadening the scope beyond transitioning only away from fossil fuels, and the work is directly affected to something that's much more fundamental. And a key part of that is fair access to the transition's opportunities. But the challenge is that building a case for whole of economy, whole of society approaches to just transitions, and building a case for more equitable access to the transition's opportunities has been difficult. And I agree with Tasneem. We've had some wins, but it still is a challenge. And part of how Africa was communicating it in the recent COP was framing the just transition as an enabler of ambitious climate action rather than the result of ambitious climate action, and therefore it's a necessary ingredient to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So completely in agreement with Tasneem. And ultimately, if you've got fairer or more equitable access to the opportunities, you've got a greater ability to implement climate action domestically, more likely to have international cooperation, more countries and actors on board with 1.5 and fossil fuel phase out. But the challenge there is that there's currently within or under the UNFCCC no significant finance and means of implementation support for green industrialization. So, and I think part of the challenge there is that everyone wants to capture the value associated with the transition. There's significant value there. No one wants to give up their lunch. No one wants to give up their position in these value chains. And so, yes, while the transition represents one of the greatest global reallocations of capital that we've seen, without intervention, the costs and the benefits will not be equitably distributed, and we're seeing this. So, and the interesting thing is, Africa has a big opportunity here, particularly around critical mineral value chains, and that can deliver the kind of transformative outcomes that we need to overcome that extractivism again that Tasneem mentioned. And this time, I mean, Africa has been trying to leverage its mineral wealth for a long time. But I think there is something different about this time, which is, obviously the very significant demand, but also Africa's strong positioning in those value chains in terms of the reserves of those minerals. But still facing systemic barriers in terms of being able to capture that value, and deliver those sorts of benefits. So within the COP, the most recent, Africa called for inclusion of text on critical minerals, particularly in the Just Transition Work Program. And there was some support for this, and certainly some pushback. Comments like, there's no agreement around the definition of critical or transition minerals, and certainly some of that higher level pushback around around green industrialization and some of those dynamics I've just mentioned. And so, the reality is, well, in the end, there was none of that text made its way into the decision. However, I mean, in the G20, we've had some important progress. So we saw a G20 critical minerals framework come out. And in there, I think there are some bridging opportunities. So I think that with a bit more work, we can bring more of that green industrialization, mutual benefit kind of together into the UNFCCC, and into kind of unlocking these whole of economy, whole of society approaches. We also saw some support for, exploring the positive role of trade in supporting just transitions. Again, this becomes, positive levers for what, Africa would need. So from my perspective, I think what we need to collectively build this case for whole of economy, whole of society transitions. We now have a good basis. We now have some progress, with the just transition mechanism. We need to design and implement that just transition mechanism to deliver the benefits to the people that matter. We need to find ways to enable mutually beneficial implementation partnerships that can unlock support and enable green industrialization in Africa and in the global South more broadly. And then just to the sort of latter part of your question, I think we need to bring this whole of economy, whole of society, just transition framing, into other fora, into the private sector processes, for example, into other international processes driving finance, trade, and investment. Because as much as we're not doing enough, a lot is happening. A lot of capital is flowing, but it's not flowing in a way that's going to address these equity issues. If anything, it's going to exacerbate inequality. And then we're facing a situation where that undermines international cooperation, and that undermines our further ability to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think these, for me, are some of the key areas that we can focus on going forward.
Great. And as you were mentioning, also moving within the private sector, I'll move to Niels. Niels, you represent a huge movement on trying to make also the climate business case for many private sector. How did you see those discussions, particularly on and how we building this new economy and the discussion on alignment of the trade, industry, and investment from a corporate perspective? How was it? How did they take conversation within the COP, but particularly outside, where would those messages or those type of discussions, where the private sector would like them to see them?
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Idri, for convening this conversation. I think first it's important because if we look like 10 years ago, the business were attending the COP here in Paris, but I would say more like an observer. The Paris Agreement would be more for policymakers to design a new framework. And I think this is the first observation. Now, 10 years after, and maybe also, and no one did mention that, but also thanks to the 2030 agenda, I think that the business sector, but all the actors just changed the perception of the climate actions. And I have the strong conviction that through the SDGs, everyone understood that there is a strong relation between social issues and environmental issues. And that's what we are saying about just transition. And I think also that for the private sector, it was a huge shift to have a different understanding of sustainability. I think that sustainability is no longer only about values and goodwill, but it's also nowadays a key lever to transform the company business model. And I think for the company, it's a huge change on how they understood what role they can play in the world through the Paris Agreement, but also through the 2030 agenda. And we can have, and I can share some example. The first one, and maybe the first obvious one, would be through the innovation and R&D. If we look to the company, so many innovation related to low carbon technology have bloomed, and I'm not going to discuss about that. I'm sure that Karine de Boissozon have many examples to share with us about what you are doing in your company. But innovation and R&D is important. The second one, and some of you already mentioned the new challenges, is about the national regulation framework. It's quite a pity because if we look to the international, dynamics, everyone wants to move forward. But in the meantime, if we look to the local or regional regulation and framework, it's a huge challenge worldwide. I'm not going to describe, you are all aware of that, but for the company, especially for the company acting in different countries, when you have to deal with different frameworks, but you are committed to the Paris Agreement, but the national country are not completely aligned with the same agreement. And of course, we all think about the USA, not being part of the Paris Agreement anymore is quite a challenge for the company. But in the meantime, I could observe in Belém that I heard none of the company engaged on the different panel not to be committed to the Paris Agreement and not to be committed to the 1.5 pathway. And it could seem obvious for everyone, but it's not so obvious when you heard companies saying it's not only about the 2 degrees, it's about the 1.5 degrees, and we want to fight. This is what I heard. We want to fight to be sure that we are not reaching the 1.5, and even if we know that 1.5 is too late, we will do everything we can do to reach the 1.5, because this is the responsibility and the accountability of the company. It's quite obvious, but in the fragmented world we are living in, having companies committed to this Paris Agreement, I think it's a great achievement from the COP. The third example would be how the company can balance short-term and long-term strategy. And it's not so obvious because nowadays, especially because of all the geopolitical tension, they have to deal with that, and especially with the investors. And I think that, and some of you mentioned that the just transition is a nice way for company to balance short-term and long-term economic issue, because they understood that they have to relate it economic, social, and environmental in the same strategic conversation within the company, and that they can't and they cannot disconnect all this issue. But in the meantime, we all know that we can't deal everything in the same year, in the same time, and you need all the times to balance between the different time scale. Maybe if we look also to the constraint, of course, there is a policy uncertainty, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, and fragmentation. And we all know that financing sustainability is also a challenge. We all know that. And so the question and the constraint for the company would be how to balance between all this national framework and compliance, but also with your voluntary commitments. And I think this is, well, a constraint and opportunity for company to mix between compliance and voluntary engagement, but also how to pledge for sustainable finance, because they know that they need to invest in all these issues that have been shared by my colleagues. But it's not so easy, because even if everyone is keen to be engaged, we all know that with developing countries, quite kind of developing countries, and even China is not so easy, second economy in the world, but still considering at the developing countries. There is quite a paradox also for the company. Same for Brazil, the 10th economic in the world is not a poor country, but in international framework is still a developing countries. For in the perspective of the financing sustainability for company, is not so easy to manage all these new framework, all these new geopolitical challenge, and that's the constraints they have to deal with.
Thanks so much, Niels. And as you were raising this last point, a bit that also reflects, right, the back to the theory of change of the Paris Agreement. Every country has a different starting point and different circumstances. So one of the ways to make sure that you can create this bottom-up framework that Tasneem was saying was like, well, let's set up the long-term direction of travel. So we have everyone, because we're creating jointly a new economy that is more equitable. And what we do is we set the long-term direction of travel, so everyone knows where the landing point is, and then everyone will find the path. And one of those ending points is indeed the 1.5, or at least well below, plus getting to 1.5, which I completely agree. That was one of the big things, that it's reaffirmed, and It's there also a direction of travel for adaptation and for aligning the financial flows globally. And that was anchored in the Paris Agreement. That continues to show that the direction of travel. And that's what the way the Paris Agreement equips stakeholders to understand, to give some certainty on where to go. But and we said, no, and looking at the diagnosis, you look, and indeed that, at least on the mitigation side, has been quite successful, meaning that the countries that would cover more than 80% of global emissions have binding targets to get to net zero, companies as well, municipalities as well. So that kind of anchor of the net zero has been well understood and is an anchor that allows for climate action to move. But the question that I'm going to put to the next three panelists, Carlos, Karine, and BiPAP, is how can we strengthen that direction of travel? Because especially so that investors, companies, countries, everyone can plan confidently around that direction of travel. And particularly, kind of also integrating what we saw at COP30 and what Mayara was saying around the fossil fuel. It felt at some point that there were doubts, on what needs to happen with the fossil fuels, or maybe because it was framed in a top-down manner, maybe because it was framed as one single pathway. But what the media hears is that there might be questions on the direction of travel. So how to advance that, to make sure that more scientific normative view on what we have to do remains part of the driving seat for the actions to be taken the next years, and particularly for the transition away from fossil fuel. Carlos, would you like to start? I know you were very much engaged in the sectoral roadmap and the transition away from fossil fuel roadmap. So maybe from that experience, you also have insights on what to do going forward to get that endorsement.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Marta, not only for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here among some friends, but also for all the exchange that we have been having all through the years, and also at the very last moments at COP, trying to see if we could find solutions for a direction of travel. I think there are some elements that some COPs gives us hope, and so 10 years ago, the hope came from, let's say, a strong engagement, a completely different geopolitical context, but a strong engagement from global leaders around the world. We had at some point even the so-called G2 of the climate, which was the US and China finally talking to each other, and is also helped to unlock a series of other levels of engagement from countries. But we also had science and scientists speaking out loud, and IPCC much more respected than we see nowadays within the corridors and the round and the negotiation table. And we also had more leaders around the world, not only Pope Francis with the Laudato Si, but several other leaders from other religions also moving and calling for a global pact for the people and the planet. In 2015, in this very fragmented world, well described by dear friend Tasneem, the hope came from the strong leadership of the host country. And so from President Lula, COP30 was not like any COP. It was a COP happening in Brazil, it was a COP happening in the Amazon. And I remember, and probably most of us will remember at COP27 after the elections when President Lula was elected and he went to COP. It was like Brazil was coming and landing back in the planet. And so the hope came that we would have a strong leadership from the Global South. And at COP, President Lula showed that, and it was unprecedented level of engagement of the head of state, in my opinion. President Lula and also some of his ministers, like Minister Sonia Guajajara, that turned COP30 as the most participatory for indigenous peoples groups ever. We had around 1,000 badges for indigenous peoples representatives at the Blue Zone. This is the triple from the previous COP, with the most participants from the indigenous peoples groups ever in the Blue Zone following the negotiations. And we had the Minister Marina Silva. Minister Marina Silva was the real driving force behind convincing President Lula to bring his political leadership to the negotiations and push for COP to start planning the elimination of fossil fuels and deforestation. It was never, let's say, a solution fitting all countries, but it was, let's really start the conversations in Berlin. And this is the hope came from this engagement from President Lula. Aside from that, we need strong democracies as the host of conference to ensure that not only when we have a broader participation, all the voice from different sectors are reflected and heard in the corridors, but also that the process reflected that. And all through 2015 is also very challenging geopolitical times. We saw the COP30 presidency investing a lot on this approach, this mutirão approach. Everybody collectively working together towards, let's say, bold outcomes. We had 10 letters of presidency before COP, one in the middle of COP. We had the COP30 circles of ministers of finance, the ethical stock take. We had circles of people and the circles of former presidents of COPs. This was very important in terms of mobilizing political will for this COP. And so I think we need to acknowledge that, but this is also very important for the years to come. And but at the end, we shouldn't miss some opportunities. And so COP30 was not, while we know all the limits of this process, and no one would expect a revolution considering the context we live in, we shouldn't miss an opportunity when we have someone like President Lula pushing so strongly for the COP to be the COP of truth. It was the COP of truth, of course, on the progress that we had on language, as Mayara mentioned, for indigenous people's rights and the Afro-descendants, very important for Brazilian groups representing slavery descendants. And we also need to acknowledge the important progress on the just transition mechanism. It's very important, but the real issues were not addressed. And so when we go to the negotiations and some of the real issues are not addressed, it's like we being an assembly of a condo where those who party till 5:30 in the morning want to convince those who have to wake up at 6 to go to work, that 30 minutes of sleep is better than nothing. And they need to be also convinced that they will have to share the fine that the city hall will impose because of the disturbance in the neighborhood. And so we cannot leave COPs without acknowledging that it was a COP. Well, in the language of the mutirão decision, that's mindful that we are in the heart of the Amazon. Very important to acknowledge that, but in terms of the results for forests, for nature, and to bring close together even the different conventions that address biodiversity, climate, and desertification, we left COP well behind. We didn't have a roadmap on deforestation, which is a process that is less challenging, in my opinion, that the one on fossil fuels. And we didn't have the one on the fossil fuels. I think it was a missed opportunity because President Lula didn't put that on in his speech. He was there with the bringing together 43 heads of states and governments in the Leaders Summit, but he wasn't framing this push for the roadmaps. In his opening remarks, he came back to COP in the second week and spent a whole day in bilaterals. And the whole focus of these bilaterals was on the two roadmaps. It was, once again, not a process that would fit a solution that would be top down. It was like, let's look into different conditions from countries. And we unfortunately left COP without that. And the mandate that was self-granted by Ambassador André Lago to himself to lead the discussions, it's important, but it's without the teeth of a COP decision. I doubt that we will see much discussions on happening, very effective discussions moving on down to under this mandate on both sides, deforestation, fossil fuels, and I don't think that this will be effective. However, we are seeing some movements, important movements at the domestic level already, and we need to pay attention. We could start thinking about all those countries that have already committed to 100% of renewable energy, for example, speaking on fossil fuels, and especially, let's say, small island states. I have been in the backstage engaged in some bilaterals with the ministers from small island states that they were the ones pushing hard for the roadmaps, speaking that it was a matter of survival. And so their leadership is reflected in their NDCs, at least in many of them. We saw Brazil and Norway starting discussing their internal process to set the fossil fuel roadmaps, the national roadmaps. I think this is remarkable, very important. We had Colombia leading what became a group of about 80 countries supporting a call for the transition away from fossil fuels, at least as a process. And Colombia and the Netherlands will host the first international conference of just transitioning away from fossil fuels next year in April in Colombia. And the Pacific Island states will host the second conference. Once again, just coming back to this missed opportunity. We understand well the challenge imposed by the geopolitical context, and beyond that the countries have completely different circumstances and conditions and just transition on energy requires speaking also about economic diversification. And one solution, we don't have one size fitting all. We'll have to have different pathways for different countries, from different clusters, and of course, rich countries needs to move fast, and need to lead on their transition, but also on financing the transition for those that are more vulnerable than others. Thank you. I'll come back to deforestation in the next round.
Thanks, Carlos. I know that there's a lot to share there, and indeed, the missed opportunity in that teeth. At the same time, as you were saying, and Mayara also know that we have now, were raised politically, so up to probably many of us now know how to take it forward. I just also want to, recall a very good collaboration that is also with Catavento, with a brief that we have out there for those that are interested on what would be some of the elements of the roadmap, particularly on this dialogue between large consumers and producers, that could help probably understanding better, how to manage this potential disruptions on the global markets and how they would affect different people. And then, as Carlos was saying, there was a lot of work on also trying to understand what is that national approach, to this global roadmap. So with everything that we already have, what is this composite of national plans and moving away from fossil fuels that many countries have. And I'm sure that Karine from EDF, Électricité de France, also can tell a bit more on that, that this direction of travel, how it's helping planning, how it's helping big companies like you to really do that transition away from fossil fuel. So Karine, please.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have to say, I really like watching the discussion on the chat, because it comes back as well to what is the role of corporates, right? I mean, you have the two extreme: either we are the fossil fuel lobbyist, or we are the solution, we are greenwasher, or we are a green husher. So it's a very tricky position to be in. When you look at COP30, so there was this, I think 1,600 corporates were tagged as fossil fuel lobbyists. And when you just look at the Excel file of the list, you had International Solar Alliance, Wind Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's a bit sad that we have this lack of trust that is very massive these days. So I think we all need to be a bit more positive on the way we can engage together. But anyway, coming back to EDF, I think, of course, we are a very special animal in the sense that the duration of our assets is very long. Okay, I mean, my hydro dams are 77 years old, and they look super, super pretty, but they are old, right? And we want to have them run for 100 years, right? So we know for a fact that climate change is impacting us. It's already impacting us today. It will impact us tomorrow. So in a way, the Paris Agreement for us is about being robust, being resilient, okay? And I really like the fact that it's not just about reduction of emission, but it's about climate adaptation, and it's about just transition. I think it's been very special also in France. I mean, when you do the survey about climate change, and we do that every year, they expect a lot. Our citizens, they expect a lot from corporates. We are very different from the rest of the world. I mean, in the rest of the world, people think that government needs to act, 70%. But if you look in France, we are almost the same level as government and citizens themselves, right? So there is a strong expectation that we need to be a force for good, and we need to bring solutions. So I think for us, being also 100% state-owned and having, as I said, this very long duration, it's super important that we keep this framework and visibility. Because otherwise, we cannot change the energy system overnight, okay? So we're talking about transmission grid, we're talking about power stations. And so the biggest risk is having stranded assets, okay? Assets that have no value in a world that is getting hotter. So for me, the COP and Paris Agreement has been really the framework for us to look at what is the safe operating system for us and what is the lobbying that we need to do to make it happen, okay? And I'm very, very happy in the journey that we've had over the last 10 years, because we moved from looking at Scope 1 to looking at a climate transition plan. And I know that it's very sad today because the EU regulation is scrapping the fact that we need to produce a climate transition plan with a CS3D, but I think it's essential that you have a climate transition plan. And this climate transition plan is only credible if there is planet boundaries and just transition. And so I think this is really the framework we've been interacting with. But my worry is, as I started at the beginning, is the lack of trust and the fact that we might struggle to actually move away from the greenwashing, but the greenwashing is worse in a way, in my view. Because if I think about the CEOs, when I started in 2019 as a chief impact officer, it was the time where all the CEOs, they loved talking about net zero, okay? Of course, some of them probably, they didn't really have a credible plan at the time. But because the CEO was super excited, all the executive committee guys, they wanted to show off to the CEO, right? And so everybody was excited to have their own roadmap, etc. Now nobody talks about it, okay? So, and if you don't talk about it, then it's not a subject anymore to the governance, right? So we need to make sure that we talk, but we should not be afraid that if we talk, we are seen as the lobbyist and the greenwasher, etc. So we need, of course, we have to be credible. I'm not saying that there's no greenwashing or no fossil fuel lobbyists. I'm not saying that, but I think we need to be more supportive and give some trust to the people who are really trying.
Thanks so much, Karine. And I'm going to pick up your words on we need to talk. And as we move to Vaibhav, and who comes from India, and also recall that Carlos, one of the Carlos insights was that the strong leadership was key. So of course, we all look at India for their capacity, to also, be a leader in the climate regime. So how does India sees this long-term direction of travel? How much willing to be vocal about, to talk about it, as Karine would say, and what other political considerations around this that you would like to share? Vaibhav, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Marta, and ISRI colleagues for inviting me for the very interesting discussion. I think the first thing I want to say is a broader comment that when I've been following this whole debate and the Paris Agreement unfolding in the last decade, and you look COP after COP, I think that one thing that jumps to me, this is a platform where emotions collide with the strategy, and that's very interesting. Because at one level there are deep emotions, and there's a reason for that. Especially in the developing world, commitments that were made were not being fulfilled in terms of own emission mitigation by the developed world, which means less of carbon space is available. So that's why you will see this carbon budget and carbon space debate, a very big debate in the developing world, that continuously less and less is available. Second, even means of implementation and support, like finance, especially in a big way, that never came. And now the expectation, even if it comes, it will be peanuts, right? So those kinds of things make many of these countries like deeply emotional about the issue, and then new surprises like CBAM. So that's another very interesting thing in the mix now. That's a very new surprise. So a lot of these things, that's why whenever we hear this, all of these agenda fights, these things have to be in the agenda, which this time the Brazilian presidency maneuvered very smartly. But you can see there's big agenda fights about having these things as the core discussions. In fact, for the first week, that's the only thing I heard about these big four issues, which were not even there on the formal agenda, but that's what everybody is talking about. Because that is extra. I mean, people are very emotional about these issues, So that's one thing, which is this whole emotion. The question is, what is the strategy thing I'm talking about? And I think that's become very interesting, because all these climate discussions are unfolding in this very cold, calculated, and ruthless world of macroeconomic strategy and geoeconomic strategy. And that has always been the case. I was heavily involved in this this Kigali Amendment discussions for very long, and that's also, I saw something very, very similar, that countries are using essentially these agreements and COP decisions as tools and instruments to figure out how do they maximize their national gains. So I'm not at all talking about corporate strategy here. I'm just talking about country level strategy, So countries are just trying to figure out, the transition is happening. How do you maneuver things through these processes so that, my country gains the maximum? And some countries are very good at it. Not every country, unfortunately, is so strategic. Some countries might be strategic, but they don't have the resources. So they can understand what is happening. They just can't do anything about it because they don't have the capital to really move things around, But some countries have got the understanding and have got the capital to move around things. And they're gaining, they're just ensuring that they are very well placed. So that is what I think, as we are moving forward, I think these things will continue. I don't think things will change, because this cold, calculated, ruthless word of strategy will continue the way it is, because that's a larger backdrop in which everything is evolving, and the other emotions will continue to be flaring up in all these conversations. In as far as the macroeconomic gains are concerned, we already know which countries are already gaining from the transition in a very big way. They're very well placed. But think about countries that are losing. Like, why does the Middle East, especially Saudi, is so vehemently opposing to this? Because if I just talk about, let's say, India and Middle East, right? In India, if the biggest challenges are energy affordability, those kinds of things, right? So if the cost of alternative technology falls down, which is where markets come in, which is very important, because markets at the end will deliver. So if the cost of these technologies will come down, it will make things a lot palatable for many countries like India, right? So that is one part of the story. But other countries where their economy is dependent on fossil fuel, it's a very hard bargain for them. I mean, I think we must agree to that. In fact, I don't like this debate at all, this me versus you debate, that we are the defender of climate and you are the villain. That happens. It's a very, it's a sad state of affairs in the debate, because we must know that if 40% of your economy is dependent on oil in terms of just GDP, what do you do about it? It's very easy to say that you are rich, so you can do an economic transformation. It's never that easy. So each country is trying their best in their own nationally determined way to figure out an answer for themselves and ensure that the economy does not, go down in a big way. And that is a difficult thing for some, and it's an opportunity for the others. So I think that's how the conversation will continue to evolve. I think markets is a very important role. So I do hope that markets will end up delivering, which will make at least many countries come around the table, including India. But for some other countries like the Middle East, I think, I think what I'm also seeing that this, let's say, just transition mechanism, I think a very good, of course, great progress. But some part of me also tells me, when I take a step back, that it's so late, it is too little, too late. But just because we have waited for so long, we celebrate these things. I am like, will they deliver anything? So it was the same as the loss and damage fund. It was celebrated tremendously, I think, in Sharm el Sheikh. That's where we got it. I mean, I don't know when it will deliver. For how long will it end up deliver? I mean, will it actually deliver in terms of the big things that we want to deliver, and when will it deliver? So those are the kinds of things I think. We'll have to just figure out. We are in a stage that we are celebrating these very small wins when the big game is happening somewhere else. So the big thing is about economies. I think, of course, communities at that level, everything is linked. But I think we have to also figure out what do we do about economic transformations at that macro level, along with this just transitions that are also at the micro level. So those two things, I think, have to be linked. And again, as I said, nationally determined nature is extremely important. We have to respect this nationally determined nature of economic transformation, and we have to figure out ways to create trust in the process. Because my biggest worry is countries will continue to engage just for the sake of multilateralism, because they don't want to break the process. But if trust continues to be frayed at the rate at which it is being, we have seen many surprises, including the US presidency surprise. So we might again be surprised at how suddenly this time there was no consensus and countries walked away. So we should never take anything for granted. Just because things are moving, we should not assume it will always move. And so that's why I think focusing on building trust in the process from the long-term evolution of how countries will act and how the system will move, I think focusing on building trust is very important. And that's where, I don't know what to do about CBAM actually. I think it is opened a Pandora's box. I won't talk about it. I'll share an op-ed I've just recently written on it. But I think we have to figure out how to create trust, not really take into the opposite direction. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vaibhav. The issue where you were saying about, okay, but what can we achieve within the UNFCCC? I think we all agree here from the start, also going back to that theory of change, was like the COP can do many things, but it basically relies on everyone else to actually implement many of those enablers and many of the things that need to happen in order for the emissions to reduce, or for resilience to be increased, or for the financial flows, and particularly here, moving on the finance, you was saying, from this process, finance is peanuts, but this process sets the alignment of financial flows globally, everywhere, according to to the Paris Agreement goals, that means that these signals, that political signals that we send, and these goals need to be diffused across institutions, sectors, and society, in addition to what needs to be done at the national level, because those are the ones that can it's the outside that we need to mobilize in order for these climate goals to happen. So, and when we were looking at this diagnosis, some diffusion has happened, definitely. So there is a good integration of climate goals across policies, sectors, societies. And that's why we've seen some positive movement on the markets. Always, probably not properly distributed, not fast enough, etc. But basically, the question I'm going to put now to the next two panelists, Andrew and Anna, how do we preserve the positive market dynamics while we manage also the disruptive effects that we are seeing within the geopolitical context, but also given maybe some other systemic barriers, as Anthony was referring to. Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to Idri for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. Maybe just start quickly by saying what we are at the We Mean Business Coalition, because actually our history is quite tied to the Paris Agreement, so it feels a bit appropriate. We were founded a year before the Paris Agreement, actually, by 7 existing business organizations. So we celebrated our 10th birthday last year. But really to bring for the first time this sort of united positive business voice calling for stronger ambition in climate policy, and in particular out of the international processes. And that was new at the time, and Niels referred to it a bit earlier in his remarks that before then there hadn't been this kind of united positive business voice showing that there is these international signals really matter for businesses, for investors, to give confidence and to set this kind of long-term signal, this long-term direction of travel. Because even though these agreements are not in themselves policies and regulations, and in fact, even the country plans under the Paris Agreement are not in themselves actual policies, the NDCs, which we haven't talked about much yet. But they're extremely important in setting the framework and giving this kind of confidence, because what businesses always call for, what they really, those businesses that want to lead, they need this predictability, this long-term signal, and kind of anything that can get them out of the short-termism that the market tends to force them towards. So, we were founded to really push for these strong signals coming out of the international process. We've been doing that now ever since, actually through several kind of evolutions, I would say, in the sort of role of businesses and how they're perceived, and really trying to build trust that there is, a genuinely positive business voice. And, I second what Corinne was saying about while there is a serious problem with fossil fuel lobbyists undermining these processes, the list that gets published every year is really not those people, right? It's a great number of really positive actors in that list. So we're doing what we can to try and build that confidence that there is a genuinely positive business voice. And we're actually we started this year what we call a call for accountability, like a voluntary standard for businesses engaging with the COP to show that they are there in good faith and to have that come forward. Coming to kind of the situation we find ourselves in now, and your question about how do we maintain this kind of positivity and positive market dynamics, I think we are in this kind of paradox, right, where in many sectors the fundamental economics are absolutely with this transition, and it makes business sense, and it is a source of future competitiveness, and yet the politics is difficult and is mostly against. And we saw this playing out in the particular situation of COP30, and I'd say there's paradoxes emerging there too. The fact that, as others have said, but that the transition away from fossil fuels was not even on the agenda, and yet became the most talked about, and kind of one of the main stories emerging from this COP is absolutely indicative that this transition is happening. There are big private sector forces who want it to happen, as well as, of course, governments and civil society and everyone else. And I think we won't see that going away now in any of the future COPs, regardless of what the blocking countries want to do. So it's a very interesting split away from recognizing that the outcome of the COP is much more than what the formal consensus is, and we can do a lot with that going forward. But in terms of the kind of more general paradox I referred to of, why is it if the economics is good, the politics is bad, so to speak? I think you can point to two main things, right? One is there's a kind of a battle of narratives and disinformation and information going on. There's some very organized disinformation and kind of negative lobbying by those who want to slow down this transition, interests of the fossil fuel industry and others, and that gets picked up in the press and sets a kind of negative tone around this transition, which is damaging and in some ways ironic, in that this is a potentially very business-led sort of technology-driven transition, which should really appeal to conservative principles and governments on the right of the political spectrum, and yet it's not, partly because of this kind of narrative issue. And the other big area I think you could point to is that people are worried about costs and cost of living, and businesses also concerned about costs and energy costs, and that we're not yet seeing the real low costs of particularly renewable energy and all the clean energy technologies, renewables plus storage and electrified technologies really coming through. And so what can we do about these two things? Firstly, on the kind of narratives and messaging side, we're really working to bring forward the message of business, showing that they are still acting, that they want this transition. And this year, you could read in the press that it seems like businesses have given up on climate change, whereas it's really not the case. We polled 1,500 business leaders this year, and 97% of them said they want to see this fast transition. 50% of them said they would consider relocating countries to governments that do have stronger policies in place. And in a different poll, 90% of business leaders said they, in the last year, have actually increased or maintained their investments in their net zero transition, but they're looking for the countries where the policy dynamic is stronger. So really bringing forward these stories, showing that it's happening, getting that picked up in the press to sort of change this narrative, and then really making sure that the sort of what you might call the positive lobbying voice, kind of the real positive advocacy around transition is being heard by policymakers. And we call this responsible policy engagement, doing a lot to bring together businesses to make sure that this positive voice is speaking louder than who else might be whispering in the policymaker's ear. And really being clear about what we mean by policymaker, because it's quite a general term, right? And you have to go to make sure it's getting quite local now, to sort of politicians hear from their districts, from their constituencies, that there are clean tech businesses that are growing and are creating jobs, and just to sort of persuade them almost one by one that this is happening. So there's a lot can be done on this kind of narrative evidence of action kind of area. But the second point is about why are people not seeing the lower cost, is then much more sort of traditional policy field, and really about just getting the incentives right finally. One of the big push we pushed going into this COP was got a large number of business organizations to sign a statement to governments that they just finally want to see these incentives taken away from fossil fuels and put towards the clean technologies where there are these growth competitive opportunities, to make sure that we can bring the cost down to everyone. And it's not just subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, that's important, but also just power market design, bringing it up to date with a renewables-led power grid, and many other sort of granular policies that we need. So yeah, looking ahead, I think there's much more we can do on to bring forward the market dynamics, as you said, is this really winning around the narrative and showing the evidence of action, and then focusing on policies for getting incentives right, and in particular for electrification, which we think is a big push, so we can win a lot of support around people seeing the benefits of electrifying the economy as a positive narrative going forward. So yeah, let's stop there. Thank you again for the invitation.
No, thanks so much, Andrew. And I know we all ask you to be very brief, so it's very challenging to you giving so much information. I'm going to move to Anna also. So the politics are bad, Andrew said. What is your angle to that? How would you then avoid or improve those to preserve the positive dynamics we see? Anna, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I mean, I'm not sure I can contribute some positive noises about where the politics are. I think if we see, if we think about Paris, the world was in love with each other, right? China was in love with Europe, with US, everybody was in love. And then we had this great agreement between US and China. And then with the help of friends, we got the Paris Agreement. Right now, everybody's fighting with everybody, basically, right? So in a way, we're in a massive fragmentation. The world is right now in the process reordering itself, who's in charge, who's not in charge. We are moving, the way we see it from Chatham House perspective is we're moving back from a rule-based world order to a rule of force. And what does it mean, right? So it's and also if you think about sort of in terms of where we are, in terms of sort of global turbulence, geopolitically, also domestically, right? We know that many countries many panelists talked about, like many countries face their own domestic economic turmoil, cost of living, fiscal constraints. There are polarizations of domestic politics as well. So Europe, UK, we all have this, fight against the far right. So, and then we also have war in Europe and in the Middle East. So it's not that the context in which we need to move, in which we need to do this transition, like the environment, the operating environment, extremely turbulent. And if we think about the necessity, and everybody talks about the necessity of climate transition, right? And for me, I mean, I'm Brazilian, I come from a developing country. I look at climate change as a socioeconomic transition challenge, right? It's never about environment. It is all about the pathway that the country chooses. I mean, the colleague from India, sorry, I can't pronounce your name, I apologize. But you know what you said about sort of, it is about economic structure. It is about productive sector. And so what are the signals? And these are long-term investment cycles, right? The private sector colleagues, like when we need for like the next phase, right? It is around implementation. What private sector, even governments are looking for is stability. And what we don't have is the stability. We don't have the political stability domestically. We don't have the political stability globally, given all the trade wars. And then sort of almost like our collective challenge then is, can we be sources of stability, right? Can we form small like coalitions between countries, coalitions within sectors to provide a certain level of stability to say this is the direction of travel? Because I think in the absence of that, like what can you do in the voluntary sector? I mean, voluntary as in like sectoral voluntary initiatives, working at, Andrew talked about like very specific sectoral issues to the granular level, like those are the stability that we need to look for. And also these things are linked to the ability of the labor force, right? Even if you have the economic, the sectoral sort of actions and the stability there, like do you have the labor force to move into that transition? I think one of the bigger questions we talk about sort of you need those critical minerals for the energy transition, but there is a difference between owning those endowments plus to the ones who have the capacity to process and sort of to invest in innovation and have the human capital to deliver that. And I think this is why for a lot of large emerging economies, those are the questions that we need to be able to solve, right? It is really about how do you completely transform the economic model of a country, of all the countries, right? The ones that we have to move away from this fossil fuel dependency. And my view is that, I mean, transition is happening. I think if we look at I want to say is like transition is already happening, but it's very disorderly, it's very messy, and it's extremely uneven, right? When we had the Paris Agreement, like, Mark Carney, who was then the governor of Bank of England, he said, like, the job of the central bank is to provide policy signals for an orderly transition. 10 years down the line, what we are not seeing is that order, right? And but I do think that also private sector recognize that climate change is happening. Some of them are more progressive than others, but people are planning for it. You are planning for it. We're all planning, well, we're aiming to plan for, because climate impact is happening, right? You do have like drought and rainfall issues in Brazil, or like how will water scarcity affect hydropower generating capability. So I don't bring like great news in terms of like what kind of signals we can provide. But I also feel like this is a given, as in like the world is in a very different place. And as we move forward, like how do we think? Like I don't think that asking for a multilateral agreement is going to give us that signal of stability, right? Because one agreement is not going to be able to deliver like that stabilization element. And so that requires I don't even have the answer for that. But I think for us, as a international relations think tank, is then how do you navigate? How do you make decisions in this deep uncertainty world, right? We will have to completely rethink how we make investment decisions, how do we design policies. And in a way, I do think, providing a bit of a glass half full, which is like, this is a success in the sense that, we have made climate issue mainstream. Everybody's on board, as imperfect and as uneven as it is, right? And so we have a different kind of collective challenge, which is like, we didn't plan for this global turmoil, but we are where we are. And then so we just have to be more creative. But I do want to sort of underscore what everybody talked about is about trust, right? Because what we feel like, even the domestic sort of politics polarization is it's all about lack of trust. And I do find it sometimes kind of unhelpful that we sort of have like friendly fires. We're all working on climate change and we're shooting each other. And it was just like, why is that helpful, right? And so there is a bit almost this commitment for us to move forward. She's like, if you're in the tent, if you really care about climate change, even as imperfect as it is, let's work together, because this is the only way. Anyway, I'm just going to end it there for now.
Thanks, Anna. And we will continue. I'm just going to move very quickly to Karine, because she needs to move now. And for Karine, we were asking her now, moving in that context in the near term. How do we continue doing, taking those decisions that are necessary now in the near term, particularly, for the energy transition, from your experience, Karine, please, and any last words that you want to add, of course.
Yeah, I think one of the very positive element from the COP30, which I really welcome, is the agenda and the simplification. Because I don't know if you guys realize, probably you know that, but if we add up all the initiatives that have been brought together since COP21, I think it's 600, right? So I mean, who remembers all of this? And the Glasgow one, for example, on cash, coal, cars, trees. So I think we really need to have more clarification, more impact, and this very short vision. And the fact that Brazil has brought this plan with the 5-year vision, I think this is really a path to effective implementation and short-term results. So this is really what I welcome. And the other element, which I think is also very important, is to focus really on where are the biggest impact you can have. And for us, we know that 32% of the CO2 in France is transport. Okay, we need to really crack the mobility issue. So I talk in the chat about the fake news. This is also a problem. We have to fight also on the fake news against the EV, right? So we've been really working, and with IDRI as well, on how to break this issue of the bad narrative. Also, of course, the affordability aspect, the fiscal aspect, etc. But I think we need to really get together on the biggest short-term impact we can have. And when I look at what France has just published today, which is their national low carbon strategy, mobility and electrification is the critical short-term lever. And so this is where I want to put all the energy of my team and my company, is to electrify, and not drill, baby drill.
Thanks so much, Karine, and maybe see you later. We're gonna have a second round. Karine was the second round, but with all the other panelists, we'll need to keep them probably a bit shorter. And so please, also use it as a, and your final key messages that you want to share, also given what other colleagues have been saying. But as Karine was saying, in this round, we were looking, okay, so first, we know what the context is from a climate perspective. We know that we need to accelerate emission reductions also in the very short term, and not all the countries, collectively, there are few countries that can make the difference on that. And even, or within, and few sectors also within, like as Karine was saying, where are the big gains? Because we need this in parallel to promoting the socioeconomic development for all the countries, and particularly in the global south. But that normative need that we have to reduce short emissions in the very short term with those countries that have the capacity to do so, how do we move forward with that? And I wanted to ask then Vaibhav and Carlos on the land use, Vaibhav on how do we create that need for the acceleration in the short term with the big countries that can do that?
I think, thank you, Marta. I think markets are extremely powerful. So if markets end up delivering whichever sector we're talking about, it could be green hydrogen or it is batteries, for example. So if I think if any decision that happens at the level of COP, or it could be just that some countries are investing heavily to just gain economic benefits for their countries, whichever route it comes through. But if it ends up delivering, on ground, then markets will actually deliver. So which is, I think, a great thing that we are already seeing. The second part is if countries see a pie for them in this new economic value creation. So it is one thing to keep on importing solar panels just because they're cheaper. It doesn't make countries happy at all. They want to produce in-house. This is a big thing for domestic manufacturing, job creation, and those kinds of things. So whichever sectors, and in fact, in India, I can definitely talk about whatever initiatives are being taken as only from that perspective. To invest in batteries, but how do you create a battery economy within India? How do you create a solar panel economy in India? How do you create a green hydrogen value chain? Nobody's thinking about who will buy or whatever. People are thinking we have to produce here. So that's what the government is thinking. So I think that's second very important criteria. So markets, the third is, I think finance really helps. If there is low cost finance, and I'm not, in fact, I would also say it might not necessarily always be low cost. If it is finance that even comes through, the regular channels for investment. So even if there is regular investment and FDI that comes through these countries, without big markups, huge low cost might not be needed, but these big markups that they come with currently, that is also very it doesn't work really. So I think if those things are challenged, I think countries would be in a much better position to accelerate the transition.
Thanks so much. Carlos, where are the big gains in the land use sector?
Okay, thanks a lot. This also related to the one of the other missed opportunities at COP, which was to deliver a decision, bring it closer together, the Trujillo Conventions and climate, biodiversity, and desertification. We had the COP16 in Cali from CBD and the COP16 in Riyadh from the UNCCD last year, two decisions that aimed to strengthen the political coherence among the Trujillo Conventions. And we know that you have to proceed, let's say, the big sister of the Trujillo Convention. And we left COP30 without a decision on that. And the synergies, while it can be, let's say, we can think about the beauty of the process and bringing closer together the Rio Convention, but the reality is that for countries that have, for example, large tracts of forests or ecosystems, this in nature plays a huge role. Can play a huge role not only for mitigation but also for adaptation. So protecting forests, restoring forests, for instance, is very important to ensure that we are having natural ecosystem delivering impacts for the climate, for biodiversity, and for people. Billions of people require and depend on the health and ecosystems and live and protect them. Indigenous peoples, local communities are their best guardians. And in the time frames that we have that are different between the CBD and the UNFCCC, it's also important to understand that bringing closer together the national biodiversity strategies and action plans and the NDCs might allow the countries to be more effective on delivering their mitigation goals in the time frame of the first NDCs, the targets for 2030. And the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, sets, among others, targets to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and that's targets for ecosystems restoration. And all those targets are aligned with the promise made under the UNFCCC, for example, in Glasgow, that we would reach 2030 with zero deforestation. And so by moving ahead and understanding that this process is progressing under the CBD, but ensuring that in Bonn next year and by COP31 we come back to that and put ahead some guidance and then support for countries to be effective on bringing these agendas close together. I think it would be a way to help us move faster. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Carlos. And so moving beyond these big gains, of course, I think was a gain from all of our community and more to put that focus on implementation more systematically, making sure that what's happening, it's happening well, not a bit more orderly, etc. And that focus on implementation raised a lot of good questions on what we can do inside, outside, to connect the inside and the outside of the UNFCCC. With Celine here, the head of programs here at IDRI, led with Mayara, this also brief on implementation, really like what is the capacity of this international treaty to optimize, right, the function of catalyzing implementation. So maybe ideas from that or beyond, but where do the enablers lie outside the UNFCCC, and what can be done from inside to really catalyze that implementation function?
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, and I think others have already covered some of the efforts that have been made at COP30, and I think in particular, I think Karine also addressed the issue of the action agenda and how there's been a great effort in giving transparency into the initiatives that have been launched, whether they are still operational or not, and most importantly, also aligning that with the GST as well, so that we have some coherency. So I think, it's not the first time that a presidency tries to give this focus on implementation, but I think Brazil has shown some consistency in the efforts that it has tried. What I wanted to bring like two issues that I think not necessarily received attention, but I think it could be quite promising as we think on the path forward. The first one relates to trade. At the Leader Summit, it was announced the launch of an integrated forum on climate change and trade. And the idea here is to try to break a bit of these silos and bring the UNFCCC stakeholders with the WTO, also involving civil society, academia, etc. It's voluntary again, but for those who follow the negotiations, you know how the issue of unilateral trade measures have been problematic and stalling progress across many negotiation tracks. The Just Transition Work Program in particular, and I think it was part of the reason why we didn't have a decision in Baku. And this year, thankfully, there was a lot of work to try to isolate this problem, and we managed to get a substantive decision that others have already covered. So, but the reality is that there isn't such a space where we can move beyond this punitive and market closure logic towards one that we think about how trade can be a vehicle for sustainability in a way that is win-win. So I think, we should be looking into this forum. It's emerging, it's new, and see what it can deliver. The second issue in terms of structure, very briefly, relates to finance, right? I mean, everyone has covered how this is at the core of the problem and, of course, the solution. And Brazil has tried to do work through the Circle of Finance Ministers, which build on the innovation it brought to the G20 when, for the first time, it brought both the Sherpa and finance tracks to discuss climate, right? So involved not only ministers of finance, but also governors of central bank, ministers of foreign affairs, of climate change, etc. When it tried to bring that to the UNFCCC, it faced some challenges. I think there was a lot of confusion in terms of clarity, what was the mandate for the circles. But the reality is that we need some level of engagement from ministers of finance, especially now that we do have a roadmap, which it's largely abstract, but does have some concrete ideas that we could potentially push. We have now not only the NCQG, but this commitment to triple finance for adaptation. And importantly, we did manage to achieve a work program on finance, which will discuss important questions around transparency of finance flows, etc. So there is a lot going on when it comes to finance, both within and out beyond the system. And I'm convinced that, you know, as others have mentioned in this call, if this cannot be just an issue for the UNFCCC or for climate negotiators, finance ministers do have important roles. So how can we absorb the lessons for this circle of finance ministers and engagement that we saw in the last 2 years, and think how to incorporate them into this governance would be something that we should reflect on for the year ahead.
Thanks so much, Mayara. And we talk about action agenda already, Niels, but like from a corporate perspective, how else to orchestrate better, no, or this trade, finance, and other enablers that you need to move further, please.
Thank you, Marta. So it's clear that we need cooperation, and we need cooperation between private, public, and civil society, but also among private sector itself. And this is how we are going to orchestrate the systemic change rather than acting in silos. And I think this is the most critical challenges, that everyone is acting in silos right now. As Karit said, we need to work together, and there is a lack of trust. In the meantime, I do agree with Anna Ying, it's messy. But it's messy because we don't know how to do. We know where to go, but we don't know the path. We don't have any roadmap. And that's the challenge we have. And the roadmap must be designed with everyone. And that's a challenge. And I'm not going to say again what we say, but working all together in a fragmented world, it's not so easy. So meaning that we are driving super fast. We don't know the path. We know it's a challenge, so it's not comfortable and it's going to shake up. And not everyone is wanted to be shaked up in this situation. We need strong, values, and you need to be well seated to drive fast in this situation. And just give you an example. I'm not going to describe it. The value chains. It's the most critical example in the world because it just summarizes everything we just said right now. Everyone is according with the ingredients, but not with the recipe. So how do we cook a cake if we are not agree on the recipe? So I'm not going to describe because we are out of time, but this is the main challenge the business have to face today. And with all the stakeholders, civil society, and whatever, and also what has been written on the chat. So the business needs some agenda, they need toolkit, but they need to be part of the design of the toolkit. Otherwise, it's going to be more than messy. And also, I think we face a challenge because everything needs to be science-based, but not everyone trusts the science nowadays. And even if we talk about gender balance, not everyone is agree about what gender balance means. What is, so it's also a challenge. And more of that, the fake news and the misinformation is also challenging everything we are doing right now. So we need trust, but more that we need method. And we had this discussion, Marta, in the COP on the panel where we were. And the last challenge is that not everyone is agreeing on the method because everyone wants to design a new structure, a new organization. And at the end of the day, we spend more time just to understand what's happening in all the organization than just acting. So I will have just one message. Please do not create new organization, but just use the organization already exists for the Global Compact, it exists for the company. And I think that would be the best way to engage the company, the stakeholders, just to succeed on what we have to achieve.
Thanks so much, Niels. And moving to Tasneem, so if we need orchestration, how can we orchestrate the support for just transitions?
Thanks, Marta. So, and thanks everybody for, I thought this was really a very interesting engagement. And I come back to the story about just transition because it does appear still that there's a sense that just transition is part of, a menu of things that need to happen, whereas just transition is really the frame and the means in which we do things like Niels is saying. We need to be part of. What does that mean? at national levels, every single social partner, business, government, labor, communities, should be part of a process for the just transition planning. You decide at the domestic level where you need to be by 2050, what would be the pathways. Those can be sector pathways, that could be pathways for redistribution, etc. But you determine that. And all of us, that's what just transition is about. It's an inclusive, that's procedural justice. Everybody needs a seat at the table to decide where we need to be in the future and how we're going to get there and who needs to benefit from those transitions. That's what justice is all about. So we can say transitions are happening, of course it is, and why we needed the just transition outcome is exactly because these transitions have not been just, and definitely not for the most marginalized of sections of society. So certainly, I think the just transition, and Vaibhav, I understand, we fight and these incremental bits of successes that we get in the UNFCCC, we can only do that, right? We're not going to get massive transformational change out of the UNFCCC. It's not going to happen. But we can make, important steps to create frameworks that can help us on the ground doing that work, doing that planning. What we need, of course, from the global multilateral space is, of course, the international cooperation piece, which has not been forthcoming. The solidarity piece that has not been forthcoming. And you've made extremely important points about the lack of trust. And that's going to muddy all of this. But I think that when we look at the just transition outcome for the global piece and the mechanism, I'm sorry, Vaibhav, I want to be a bit more optimistic about this mechanism, that even the mechanism itself, in the way it is established, what it would look like, the composition, etc., we should look at making it far more innovative than what any other mechanism has been so far, right? It's not a funding mechanism, but it's to pull together all the key players. It's to pull together experts and practitioners with policymakers, etc. But can we look at that kind of inclusive way where we all take responsibility for figuring out the global responsibilities for a just transition, what that would mean for national, regional transitions, etc., sector transitions. So not my faith, but I see immense hope. If we really understood what we meant by just transition, if we really understood this outcome, it is really far-reaching. I mean, this is the first time Baku was so bad in its outcome on climate finance, but in the just transition text, we literally have, again, coming back to the point around public finance, grant-based finance, non-debt inducing finance. We didn't get that. We didn't get that in Baku. So this text of the just transition outcome, if you read it, I would really encourage everybody. Please go and see what it includes. And so I think that part, the just transition, is where many of the issues that have been raised here by all people, that is where we will find the solution. Not the markets, not any particular sector, etc. This is where we're all collectively actually going to take responsibility for transitioning to a climate-safe future.
Thanks, Tasneem. I'm going to give the floor to the five last panelists that will come back with asking them, as we move forward and addressing this implementation gap, both partnerships for this cooperation, this international cooperation that you've been addressing, and also the work that needs to happen at the national level. So please, Hu Yong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, colleagues. Inspiring speech. Yes, first I'd like to say UNFCCC still is very, very important channel for us. Even it cannot solve all of our problems, but I think it's also the foundation for us. Of course, it's can play important role for political leaders to join together. So, but in addition to UNFCCC, I think we need more and more some colleagues mentioned some voluntary mechanism. Here, I'd like to emphasize the choose. One is the open coalition on compliance of carbon market. The second is the integrated forum on climate change and trade, which was initiated by Brazil government. It's very important volunteer mechanism which created some spaces for us to take actions. And I think what truly determines the speed of global decarbonization is a country's industrial capacity and economic interests. So why I mentioned the industrial capacity and economic interest is that I would like to take the China-ASEAN free trade agreement as an example. Because both parties, Chinese government and ASEAN countries, realize that we need to work together to take advantage of each other's resources to address these global challenges, especially in climate change. So under the free trade agreement between Chinese government and ASEAN, we may find lots of green finance, green technology, green energy articles. So it's I think it's a very useful examples for us to consider in addition to UNFCCC. So for Chinese role, I think it's very important. It's in the 10 years ago, China is just the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, but now it's also the largest green technology investor. So we need to fully take advantage of China's resources, especially how to use China's green technology, green finance to integrate the process of urbanization and industrialization of global South countries. It's very important for these countries to address global challenges and climate change. Thank you.
Thanks
I'll stop here.
so much. We are sorry for chasing you all, but I know that many people need to leave. So my bad moderation, blame me. Please, Andrew and Anna, the next.
Sure. Such an interesting conversation. It's not surprising it's running on. But listen, I have 3 points which I can make really quickly, actually. But before I do, I really agree on the importance of this new trade forum. I think it could be really positive to get this kind of non-confrontational forum to get countries talking about CBAM and impacts and so on. So agree with that. But my 3 points: one, in partnerships, I think this electrification issue, we would really like to see a strong coalition build around a push for a global electrification goal to be something that could be agreed at COP31 maybe, to sort of go alongside the tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. And as I said before, I think this electrification pushes a really strong positive economic area where we can get a lot of positivity and a good thing for countries to agree, and it's part of this kind of overall signal setting. So that's the first point. Second one, I think we could really continue to make more of the so-called action agenda, which is the formal channel for non-state actors to feed into the Paris Agreement. Brazil did a great job to really elevate it, and we had these hundreds of initiatives coming together and these so-called plans to accelerate solutions across multiple different areas. And going ahead, we'd really like to see that evolving into a really meaningful way for businesses and other non-state actors to engage with governments, not just on the sidelines, but if we're really talking about implementation, it has to be kind of at the heart of the thing, with criteria for accountability to make sure that it's in good faith and positive and so on. But that's the second point. And the third point is really just continuing from the business side, really continuing to elevate the businesses from the global south into this conversation. So this doesn't seem just like a global north businesses who are championing this idea, but really we work a lot with really exciting businesses across India, across Southeast Asia, from Brazil, from South Africa, and just we to see a sort of south business platform that engages and elevates those voices. So that was all. Thank you again. Really interesting conversation.
Amazing. Thanks, Anna.
I'm going to make it really short. I know that you have. I said that in my previous point. I think we move from these like relying on like major global agreements to sort of bilateral, trilateral country partnership around issues that, you know, bring it is aligned to their interests, and also sectoral action. And then there are multiple initiatives that are happening, which I think are amazing, right? I think ultimately is how do we make sure that they all connect and add up. I think that the thing about all these like almost like the fragmentation, so that they have different kind of action agendas, is just like how do they all add up to moving towards the same direction. But I think for people who work on climate change, you always have to have this glass half empty or half full, right? Because otherwise you just might as well give up. And I do think that that we have a whole different kind of challenge ahead of us, and we just have to be more creative and work closer together, right, to deliver on the implementation agenda, and making sure that the justice and fairness is right in the middle of it.
Thanks so much. Brilliant. Vaibhav. Vaibhav, are you there? Otherwise, Anthony, and then Vaibhav.
Is there?
Yeah, no, I've already given, I think, my comments, so happy to. Please go ahead, Sebastian.
Should I come in quickly, Marta?
Please, and then we'll move to Sebastian for the closing.
Okay, great. I know you want to wrap, so I'll try and be as quick as possible. But yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. You know, the importance of the market, the importance of incentives, you know, recognizing that we won't transition, and we won't transition in the way that we need to if there isn't a reason to do so, if we're not seeing viable pathways. And in many cases we are, but in many cases we're not, and we need to be realistic about that. And I think, again, just, you know, bringing in some of the Global South perspective, particularly the African perspective, we're involved in trying to implement on the ground, trying to translate, you know, these policy signals into implementation. And the frustration and the challenge is that it is difficult, that, you know, the incentives aren't always there. We don't see these viable pathways to transition out. We don't see these viable pathways to transition in. But and it's not just a domestic question. You know, the barriers and challenges to unlocking those viable pathways are very much linked to these international spaces, these international systems of finance and trade and investment. And so, you know, as much as it is a slow process and it's difficult, you know, and all the flaws that there are with these multilateral processes, it's this international cooperation space that is absolutely fundamental to getting us unstuck, to allowing us to move faster in a better and more equitable way. And building on some of the positivity, I'm also feeling more optimistic. I mean, we do need to be more innovative, but it's a space to be more innovative. You know, this current geopolitical environment, sure, it's damn difficult, but I mean, it brings with it opportunities. And now, you know, we can reflect and we can approach things differently, build on what has worked. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but come with the different approaches, the innovative approaches. And, you know, for me, the thing that we're pushing, you know, is that, you know, where we are stuck in terms of being able to transition out through viable economic diversification, or transition in, you know, to compete in these global value chains, is really where international cooperation for just transitions can represent some of the levers that can get us unstuck, that can align our incentives so that international cooperation, you know, can play its role. Thank you.
Thank you all panelists. Sorry for the delay. Sebastian, please bring us to a nice close.
Thank you very much. And I really thank you, Marta. And you did a great job. We had many panelists with lots of very important messages. So I don't know how you could have done shorter. And lots of thanks from our part to all panelists, because that was a very diverse, but still very lots of very converging ideas. I won't make a kind of a recap of everything. My impression is that actually on this 10th anniversary birthday of the Paris Agreement, climate and the Paris Agreement are actually extremely center stage, despite what the President of the United States is saying, because it's actually about the radical shift in the real economy that is happening. And that's why it's so strategic. That's why it's so contested. And I think because we were discussing that this is a new era in climate governance, it's actually the era of implementation. But we now know why that it's extremely complicated, because it's become so center stage. So international cooperation, international implementation is going to be conflictual, strategic, etc. We knew already it was difficult at national level because every country was struggling with that, but the implementation. But now we know also how contested it is at international level. So I think this new era of climate governance is a lot about enormous needs of international coordination. And you talked about the very useful shift that happened in the conversation about trade, because this is going to be extremely important. I would say that on our part at IDRI, we really look at many of the things you've said on industrial policies and how, or economic transformation policies, and how to make them not just conflicting but coordinated. And I think that's really very important. But of course, because it's so geopolitical, finding the right place where to discuss that is not easy. Hwayong said we need still UNFCCC, and that's true, because sometimes we can discuss that in another type of framework than when we directly discuss conflicts of industrial policies at WTO. So these hybrid spaces are extremely important. And I really heard a lot that domestically it's also extremely difficult to identify the right social, economic, and political pathway, and that we need these collective decision processes at national scale that are so important. One last thing that I think I want to say before really closing is I really have the impression that trust is really scarce resources and very needed, but at the same time, COP30 was a moment where some shifts happened. I mean, actually, around COP30, everybody was discussing about diversification of the economy, just as Anthony was saying. Not everybody, but a lot of the conversations were about that, about transitioning in an economic transformation rather than just transitioning away from another economy, and that this language was actually quite useful to rebuild trust. But I think even in the formal negotiations, lines have been moving, and that gives me some hope. I prefer to finish on a note of hope. I think the diplomats themselves are beginning to move in the way that they look at these questions, and I think that's really that makes me quite hopeful, even if that necessitates a lot of work. And I really want to appreciate a lot the idea that this webinar embodies a little bit the type of coalitions, alliances that we need to build between a variety of different actors, from CSOs to we should have also, of course, public decision makers, but also businesses, federations, etc. In order to open up those pockets of stability and trust that Anna talked about, and to make the pockets larger, because pockets is of course not enough. And I think that's the type of good signal that we would need to have, and that's really something where I believe we are going to continue working with all the panelists here and all their different types of organizations, because that's how we need to move forward. So thanks a lot for all panelists for their very insightful comments. Marta, thanks for facilitating. It was not easy, but you did a great job. And really, again, bon anniversaire à l'Accord de Paris, because I believe that's what we want to celebrate. We need that to project ourselves in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.